Good morning, I'm Annie Larkin, the Associate Curator of Public Programs at the Amerind Museum, and welcome to our online lecture, Hopi Runners, Crossing the Terrain Between Indian and American, with Dr. Matthew Sakiestewa Gilbert. Thank you to our members and donors who not only make this type of programming possible, but Amerind's mission to promote the knowledge and understanding of the Native peoples of the Americas through research, education, conservation, and community engagement. To learn how you can assist Amerind in supporting its mission by becoming a member or donor, please visit amerind.org. All right, to let you know about a few things we have coming up, on September 19th, Amerind is delighted to partner with the Arizona Archaeological and Historical Society to bring you a virtual tour of Amerind's Vanderwagen jewelry collection that will be hosted by Amerind President, CEO, and Chief Curator, Dr. Eric Kaldal. Please visit Amerind's website, amerind.org, or the events section of Amerind's Facebook page for registration details. On September 26th, we will have the inaugural Texas Canyon mountain bike race. You'll be able to experience the beauty of Texas Canyon in this 20-mile course, which includes a section that has never before been open to the public. Again, information for this event is available on our website, amerind.org, or the events section of Amerind's Facebook page. And this year, Amerind will be holding our Autumn Fest virtually, and it will include several online programs with Indigenous performers and artists. Amerind Virtual Autumn Fest will take place Saturday, October 17th and Saturday, October 24th. Again, visit our website, amerind.org, or the events section of our Facebook page for registration details. All right. So Dr. Matthew Sakiestewa Gilbert is professor and head of the Department of American Indian Studies at the University of Arizona and an enrolled member of the Hopi tribe. Centering his research and teaching on Native American history and the history of the American West, he examines the history of American Indian education, the Indian boarding school experience, and American Indians and sport. In addition to publishing articles and books on Hopi history, he has produced a documentary film, Beyond the Mesas, on the Hopi experience at off-reservation Indian boarding schools, including Sherman Institute, Stewart Indian School, and the Phoenix Indian School. Matthew is also serving on Amerind's board of directors currently, and we'd like to thank him very much for sharing his time and knowledge with our audience today. And thank you again, Matthew, and I'll pass the mic over to you.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Annie, and I just want to thank everybody who's here. Annie had said, well, she had said, do you want to know just how many people are on the webinar today? I'm like, I don't know if I want to know the exact number, but it's my understanding that it's in the hundreds, and I'm thrilled about that. I'm honored to be here, not only to give the presentation that I prepared for everybody who's on the webinar, but also very honored to be part of Amerind Museum. And I want to thank Amerind for this opportunity. And if you haven't visited the museum, whether it's virtually through the website or actually go in person to visit the museum in Dragoon, I would encourage you to do so. They're doing just some incredible work. There's an incredible group of people as far as curators, our the director, of course, Eric, and others who are associated with the museum. And so I would really, and I know it's a large audience that I'm speaking to spend some time, and they've done an incredible job, and they've got an Indigenous running exhibit, which is one of the ways in which I became familiar with the museum. Today's talk is titled Hopi Runners, Crossing the Terrain Between Indian and American. It's the title of my book that I published in 2018 with the University Press of Kansas. And so of course, the talk will all be centered upon that project. In the late 1800s, just to start off here, the Hopi people were causing all kinds of problems with the United States government. They were resisting the federal government in various different ways. They were resisting the federal government in the mandatory enrollment of Hopi children on off-reservation, and also off-reservation Indian boarding schools, but then also Indian day schools, different Indian day schools that were out at Hopi at the time. They were also resisting the federal government and coming to the federal government with land disputes, whether that was land disputes with the government, with local powers, with Mormon missionaries at that time. One of the more well-known instances of this throughout Hopi history is that took place in the late 1800s, late in the mid 1890s, 1895, when the federal government had arrested a group of 19 Hopi leaders and arrested them and sent them by Santa Fe Pacific Railroad west to Alcatraz Island in the San Francisco Bay. These individuals were certainly problematic for the government. They were known as resistors, and this was done to subdue them, to get them out of the way, so that government agents could continue their work of assimilation and compliance back home. So what you have here is the photograph of this group of 19 individuals who had been sent to Alcatraz Island in early, so this would have been, I believe, January of 1895, and they stayed there for 11 or so months before they were actually returned to their families. In addition to these outward expressions of resistance that these Hopi leaders had, there were other examples. If you look back, continue on into the late 1890s, but certainly the early 1900s. And this next slide that I'm showing you here really, I think, gets into the heart of today's talk. In the early 1900s, there were Hopi leaders, these Hopi men who were continuing to push back against the federal government for various different things. I had mentioned earlier in the lecture here that there was a group of Hopi leaders who were pushing back about the mandatory enrollment of Hopi children at government schools, whether that was both on or off the reservation. Throughout my career, I've made the argument that the Hopi people have never been against education. That wasn't the issue. What the Hopi people were against was this mandatory enrollment of government school, was this imposition of American ways or American ideals out at Hopi, right? So that was the issue, and that was the problem. And so throughout history, and I'm a historian, and so of course I study these kinds of moments of tension, certainly among the Hopi and Southwest Indians in general. You see these examples where people are pushing back. Indian leaders, Native leaders are pushing back in various different ways. And there was a group that was out at Hopi who were doing exactly that, pushing back against the federal governments and these mandates, et cetera. And so what the government had done is they had taken 115, I believe it was 115 of these Hopi leaders, these Hopi resistors, if you want to call them that, in late 1906, early 1907, and they arrested them, and they took them and they held them, and I believe that they held them at Fort Defiance, I think it might have been. And so they held these, and of those 115, they selected 11 of these Hopi leaders who were the most troublesome for the federal government, and they sent them on a Santa Fe Pacific Railroad to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And so what you have here in this photograph is that you have this headline, "Savage Hopi Indians are transformed into model students." And you have a picture of what these leaders looked like when they arrived at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. And then, of course, what they looked like after the power of assimilation and this whole experience transformed them into what you look like as respectable American citizens on the bottom, right? I mean, this is what these images are meant to portray. But on the top, you have them, and you see these various different accounts in historical newspapers. And as an historian who does work during this time, a lot of my research was spent in the archive or on online digital resources looking at these old historical newspaper accounts. And so what you have here on the left-hand side of the screen is some of those accounts, one of them coming from the Baltimore Sun in February of 1912, where they described these Hopi leaders as crude specimens, right, wearing discarded khaki uniforms. It also mentions in the same newspaper article that these Hopi leaders, they couldn't speak English. In fact, when they spoke in a garbled tongue, right? These are these descriptions that these American newspapers are saying about these leaders when they arrived. However, there are other accounts, and I wanted to make sure I brought these other accounts. So, for example, Glenn Pop Warner, when he was reflecting, if you recall, Glenn Pop Warner, one of the most well-known, famous American football coaches. I believe he coached football for Stanford during this time and also the University of Georgia. He was also the athletic director at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School for a number of years. He described him differently. He noted that they were studious, that they were well liked by their peers, and they are quick at learning the English language, right? And so it's kind of a counter narrative between what the American newspapers are publishing during this time about these leaders and these Hopi individuals, but then also what Glenn Pop Warner, who actually knew these students, right, and knew the situation, how they were describing it there. One of these individuals who the federal government had forcefully removed, right, arrested out at Hopi in early January of 1907, was an individual by the name of Louis Tewanima from the village of Shangolpavi. And if you look at this photograph here, Louis Tewanima, who is probably the most well-known of all Hopi runners, we'll talk more about, I'll talk more about him throughout the lecture. Louis Tewanima is represented, or he's depicted in two places in this photograph. He on the first up on top of the photograph that I'm showing you here. He is the second one on the first row from the left. The second one, bottom row from the left, and he's just sitting there. His hair is a little bit long, and then almost directly right below him in that photograph is Louis Tewanima 5 years later. So this would have been in 1912. How he would have looked, or at least how Carlisle wanted him to be portrayed to the world, right? Carlisle would often have these kinds of newspaper pictures and articles go out as a way to demonstrate the so-called power, the transformation work of American assimilation at these federal off-reservation boarding schools. They depended on money from donors to bring money to the school so that their operations would come. Little did these military officials, these soldiers, little did they realize when they had arrested these Hopi individuals, but specifically Louis Tewanima, and at that time of arrest, they considered him and the rest of the group to be prisoners of war. Little did they realize that that individual that they would arrest out at Hopi at that time would actually, in a very short amount of time, represent Americans, including themselves, those who had arrested him, in one of the most prestigious, and I would say the most world, certainly most world prestigious event, athletic event that mankind has ever known. That is the Olympic Games. So when he was sent along with this group of Hopi leaders to the off-reservation Indian boarding school of Carlisle, he was sent there. The federal government sent him there for 5 years. I have here a quote, "Into civilization and citizenship." This is, Captain Richard Henry Pratt's motto for Carlisle. You often hear this famous quote, "The kill the Indian and save the man." I think most people think that was the model that Pratt had for Carlisle, but this really was the motto that he had for the school. This idea that you would bring these native people, these native individuals. Sometimes they were very young. Sometimes they were 4 or 5 years old when they're coming to these boarding schools. And we can talk a lot about that and some of the problems, right? Traumatic experiences that these kids had at such a young age when they were being forcefully removed from their family, from their community. So sometimes they were very young, but sometimes they were older, especially when the federal government was sending Indian leaders to boarding schools. These individuals were older. In fact, Louis Tewanima, and I think there's some debate about his age, but through my research and the archival work that I've been able to do, I would put him at about 34 years old when he arrived at Carlisle Indian School. So he was a much older individual in comparison to certainly some of his peers at Carlisle. On the left-hand side of the screen there, you see what Carlisle would have looked like in the late 1800s, but this would essentially what Carlisle would have looked like when Louis Tewanima and this group of Hopis arrived at that school. And in addition to teaching these individuals at the school, right, the students, industrial trades, including trades about farming and blacksmithing and cooking, or some of the domestic trades, certainly for women, for young girls at the school, the federal government, and especially at Carlisle, had developed these very well-established sport programs. Whether it was football, and I often think that Carlisle is best probably known for its football team, coached under Glenn Pop Warner, or basketball, certainly later on. But in the early 1900s, one of the teams that got a large amount of attention, especially throughout the United States and even the world eventually, as they started competing in American Olympics, was the Carlisle track and field team. This is a really fascinating picture here. Louis Tewanima is on the bottom row, and he is third from the left of the screen. You can see him there. He was about 115 pounds. He was 5'4". So certainly one of the smaller runners at that time and athletes at that time. Of course, you have, if you were just to go 2 individuals down right in the middle of the row, if you were to well, let's say right above Louis Tewanima off to the left, in the very center is Glenn Pop Warner. And school officials had encouraged these athletic competitions to, as far as track or even football, to encourage these competitions to reinforce the values of team effort, also to reinforce competition, or the understanding of a competition, and the benefits of hard work, right? Student athletes, including Tewanima, joined athletic teams as a result of their desire to compete, to improve their athletic skills, and to demonstrate to each other and also white audiences. And I think that's an important point, that Indian athletes, if given the chance, could compete against white members of American society. However, I think furthermore, sport teams also increased the visibility of Indian schools and taught athletes the Western concepts of fair game, but then also of competition, and what the Western concept of sport and what sport can do, especially sport can do in the assimilation efforts that were taking place at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School. So you have these pictures here, and that's one of the, shortly after Louis Tewanima had arrived as a prisoner of war to the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, he joined the track team. And immediately upon joining the track team, he found a tremendous amount of success in running. He came from a community of runners, and I think that that's an important point for all of us to remember. I mean, he wasn't just a weekend runner, right? Or a runner who, when they feel bloated, that's the time that they go out. That's the time that they go out and run. But he's coming from these communities of runner. If you were to look now, I was going to say this a few minutes ago. 2 individuals off to the left is the well-known Sac and Fox athlete Jim Thorpe. And so he also was a peer, a fellow athlete competing at the Carlisle Indian Industrial School with Jim Thorpe. Well, by the time we get to 1908, Louis Tewanima had won so many races, and most of these events were on the eastern seaboard, that he had qualified to compete in the 1908 London Olympic Games. And this is a photograph of Louis Tewanima. I would think it's around the 17-mile mark or so in the marathon event that he competed in. The London Times, one of the newspapers that I consulted quite a bit in the work in the book project, noted that observed that the glorious hot July afternoon with hardly a breath of wind was ideal for a bathe or a game of cricket perhaps, but terrible for a feat of endurance. I would have tried to have said that in an English accent, but I think it would have fell flat. But it was an exciting event. I mean, certainly early 1900s Olympics, still was an exciting event. This was the marathon race that he went to. On his left is Neil McCarthy, who was a pacer at that time. These pacers would go and be with the athletes and ride alongside the athletes, and they would instruct the athletes or let them know, so many people are so and so's ahead of you. This is your time. This is your pace. He would have been encouraging Louis Tewanima in English, right? To do well or to keep going, to run strong, et cetera, et cetera. And then on Louis Tewanima's right, or the right of the screen here, is Joseph Forshaw. What we don't see here is a few handicaps that Louis Tewanima was going through. One was he had a knee injury, an ankle injury at this time. He was also suffering from seasickness, having just traveled across the Atlantic Ocean days before. And so how did he do? He finished the event in 9th place, which was huge. I mean, that was a huge event. You can imagine just how excited his peers were, right? To have him represent not only the United States, right, but also to represent the school in this Olympic game. I think there's a bit of debate out there about when exactly the Hopi people or Southwest Indian people in general became American citizens. I think there's a good argument that can be made that by 1848, through the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, there was a citizenship granted with the Hopi and other Southwest Indians. But at the very most, right, in the event that there was this idea of citizenship surrounding Louis Tewanima at that time, he was a second-class citizen, and he was representing a nation that considered him to be a ward of the federal government, right, where he didn't have all the rights and privileges that full citizenship have or individuals with full citizenship had. There was another native runner, of course, who was competing in the 1908 Olympics, Tom Longboat of the Six Nations Reserve in Canada, but he also dropped out about the 21-mile mark in the marathon event. Well, Louis Tewanima continued to win courses, win events in courses throughout the East Coast mostly. And American newspapers were writing. I mean, there are literally thousands of newspaper articles, drawings, pictures of Louis Tewanima that are out there in these archives, right? And I mentioned some of these are digital archives. I came across this article not so much looking at a digital archive, but I found this in Louis Tewanima's student file that the National Archives has. And it's a newspaper article with a cartoonist drawings and Louis Tewanima in the middle from the Globe and Commercial Advertiser that was published in March of 1909. And there was a lot of lot of interest and a lot of excitement about Tewanima, especially in the sporting scene. And there are a lot of people who are writing about him, wondering how it is that such a small athlete, right, 115 pounds, 5'4", right? How such a small athlete who are competing against some of these larger athletes, such as Clarence DeMar, right, an Irish American runner who was doing extremely well at that time. How is it that he could do so well? And if you were to look at this picture here, look at this examination of the newspaper clipping here, you see these different images here, right, as an attempt by a cartoonist to give the public an idea why Tewanima did so well. So if you see here on the bottom right, okay, there's a picture of a Hopi father, Tewanima's father, represented on the top of a hill. And the caption reads, and I know it's probably really hard to see this on the PowerPoint presentation, he's telling Tewanima, right, who's depicted in this individual running down the hill, that if you don't go to the store and get the bread, I'm going to bounce this hammer off your beam, right? So it's this idea that Hopi people were constantly having to run up and down the mesas, right? Which gave them endurance. I mean, there's some truth to that for sure. I mean, absolutely. You go out to Hopi, you do these events, right? There's absolutely a huge amount of endurance that runners experience or gain as a result of running these trails up and down the mesa, up and down the mesas. Another depiction is on the right, the top right. It's a picture of a ceremonial runner from the Hopi snake dance, which was really popular back in the day as far as an American audience go. There was a number of people across the United States and also even the world who would go out to Hopi in the 1800s and early 1900s to witness this ceremony, right? I mean, it was days long. And part of the ceremony was that there would be these runners who would go to various different sacred sites, right, beyond the mesas, and have these and bring these snakes back to Hopi. And so that's depicted there. So there's like this, like this religious thing, the spiritual thing kind of going on surrounding the Hopi snake dance. And then on the bottom left, there's a picture, a drawing of a Spanish vaquero on a horseback, and he's shooting the Hopi runner, right? You can see the bullets flying through the air, and the caption says they always had a reason to run, or they always had a reason for training. And so it's this idea that Indian people and Hopi individuals, they're running away. They're always having to run away from these forces of colonialism, right? They're always having to run away from these forces of colonialism. So you have depicted in this picture all these, what kind of looks like this backwards culture, right? Especially in American society at that time. Certainly, exotic in a lot of different ways, right? Savage-like. I think, this is how it's being reported in American newspapers. And then in the middle of all that, you have Louis Tewanima standing, right? Proud. And he has this modern track uniform on, modern shorts, a modern shirt with the C representing Carlisle Industrial School, and he has these modern athletic shoes, right? This idea that that the government had taken Louis Tewanima out of this backwards savage-like culture, right? Put him into this school and transformed him into this modern representation of a modern runner. What this, of course, this depiction, right, this newspaper article, but then also these drawings don't demonstrate is that the Hopi people and that Louis Tewanima comes from a long tradition of distance running that is so fundamental to Hopi culture and so much a part of Hopi life. I mentioned earlier in the presentation that he wasn't just a weekend runner. Like, he came from a people of runners, right? And you see this in other indigenous people group. You know, they're coming from a people of runners. It's one of the things that I always have to remind people when they talk about, oh, you know, these Kenyan runners and these Nigerian runners, they're doing so well. Yes, they're doing well. They're coming from these community of runners. They're also coming from these tribal communities, these agricultural communities. I mean, there's a lot of similarities there. I didn't really get to that in my book when I was writing it, but certainly there's a lot of similarities. Louis Tewanima, who is the former director of the Hopi Cultural Preservation Office, he had said once that when you reference to runners, right, they are for the clan runners, when they are for the blessings of the cloud people, for the rain, for the harvest. So we have a good life, and that's what these ceremonial runners do. They bring this positiveness to the people. Oftentimes, I think when individuals look at this photograph, they mostly focus on the runners in the picture, all lined up and ready to go to the race. Sometimes people will look at this photograph and look at the structures, right? The homes, these stone homes that are in the background. As a Hopi individual, one of the first things that I noticed in these pictures were these clouds that were in the background. These clouds, and some of them are dark clouds in the background. And that really speaks, I think, to this idea, this cyclical idea within Hopi culture of running. That is, these clan runners had the responsibility to run far beyond the Hopi ancestral lands to entice these clouds to follow them back to Hopi, to follow them back to their fields, their clans' fields, so that those clouds would bring them the rain, water their crops, water their fields, so that those clans would also be a blessing, not only to individual clan members, but to other clan members, to the community, at large. One of I titled the introduction to my book, To the Fence and Back. And this speaks to this too. I remember when I was writing, when I was in the thick of all the research and writing Hopi Runners, I had an opportunity to visit with Victor Messias Jr. from Hopewell. And he came out to the University of Illinois, and I spent some time with him. And while he was out there, I just asked him, I said, hey, would you like to go on a run with me? There was a park nearby in Urbana, Illinois. And I knew that, you know, Victor, I knew he probably came with his running shoes, and he did. And so we went running, and we talked together one morning, and we were just kind of running, and we did 2 laps around this particular park, which was basically a 5K, 3.1 miles. And most of the conversation, you know, had to do about running, although we talked about family and various things like that. And I remember, you know, asking him during this conversation, I said to him, I said, you know, Victor, when you go out and you run back home, right, back at Hopewell, I said, how long do you usually run? Like, how far do you usually run? And he just kind of looked at me, and I write about this. I start out my book actually with this story. He just kind of looked at me. He kind of smiled a little bit, had a grin on his face, and he says, oh, you know, to the fence and back, right? I was approaching that conversation and that question from a very Western perspective. Time and distance, right? Distance and time. That's one of those 2 factors. Runners are obsessed with those 2 factors, right? Distance and time. You can look at any edition of Runner's World magazine or online, and they're constantly trying to sell you products to improve those 2 areas in your running, right? But he's getting at something much deeper. And in a way, he was reminding me about the cyclical aspect of running that we have represented here with these runners given the responsibility to go far beyond ancestral lands, to go chase after those clouds that you see there in the distance, and to entice them. The idea that the quicker, the faster that those runners would run back to their villages, the quicker and the faster those clouds would follow them home. Well, as Louis Tewanima continues to win events, he qualified pretty early on, early 1912, to compete in the the Stockholm Games of 1912, the Olympic Games in Stockholm, Sweden. But there was another runner at this time who was making his name for himself on the East Coast. This being Philip Zeyouma of Sherman Institute from Shongobi, also a second Mesa village. And Philip Zeyouma became known because in April of 1912, he had won the Los Angeles Times Modified Marathon. And if you remember that during this time in American history, the American Athletic Club, or the American Olympic Club, the AOC, gave various different entities and organizations the responsibility to host different events so that they could secure their athletes, the American athletes, to compete in Olympic Games. Well, the Los Angeles Times had the responsibility to host this event, the modified marathon of 12 miles, so that the American Olympic Committee would have its athlete to represent the United States from the West Coast in the Olympic Games in Stockholm, Sweden. So this was a big deal, this Los Angeles Times Modified Marathon, and Philip Zeyouma won that event. He won the event, and so he earned himself a right, earned himself the privilege to compete for the United States, to compete for his school, to compete for his community, his village, his clan, in the Olympic Games in Stockholm, Sweden. But he never ended up going. And I often wondered, why is it that Philip Zeyouma never went, right? Why did he never go? Because Louis Tewanima went, competed in Stockholm, but Philip Zeyouma didn't. And so I actually had to dig, my research at the archive there in the Sherman Indian Museum, but also the National Archives. And I came across this letter that an individual had written the school superintendent at Sherman Institute in the early 1940s, inquiring about Philip Zeyouma and his athletic achievements and his trophies. There are a number of trophies at the Sherman Indian Museum that he's won that are still actually there today. And this individual was inquiring about his athletic accomplishment, and the superintendent at that time had written this individual back, and this is where I kind of came across this letter, and said that while Philip Zeyouma had earned a right to compete in the Olympic Games, he did not compete because of his father's objections, right? And that's all it said. That's all it said. Well, I've had to do some research on this, and I discovered that Philip Zeyouma's father, 2 or 3 years before, had lost at least 1 or 2 sons due to influenza. So perhaps he was worried that his father, for his son to go all the way across the other side of the world to compete for a nation that, and maybe he was upset. He did competing for a nation that hadn't even granted him full citizenship, right? Maybe he didn't see the value in that. So there are different reasons, I think, and perhaps Philip Zeyouma's father needed help back home, right, with the business or with with his fields. At any rate, and whatever the situation is, Zeyouma did not go, but Louis Tewanima went and represented the United States in the 1912 Olympic Games in Stockholm, Sweden. One of the events that Louis Tewanima competed in was the 10,000 meter event. This is a photograph that is often seen, and a lot of people look at this photograph, and I know that I've even done a presentation with this photograph back home about it, back at Hopi a couple times at Shongopovi. And when people look at that, they often think, look how close Louis Tewanima is to winning the gold medal in the 1912 Olympic Games, right? The 10,000 meter event. He is so close, because what we're seeing here is the finish line. If you look on the far right hand of this picture, you can see the pole, right? There would have been a string or something that would have represented the end of the course, right? That's the finish line. And you have Hans Kuhlamainen, also referred to as the Flying Finn. He was an incredible runner, Finnish runner, in the lead position in this photograph. But what most people don't realize when they look at this photograph is that Louis Tewanima wasn't just 4 feet, 3 feet away from winning a gold medal. he was actually a whole lap behind Hans Kuhlamainen, right? And so he passed that marker that you see there on the right, and then he just had to keep going around the track, ultimately finishing the track, the course in 30, I believe it was 32 minutes and 6 seconds. And so still an incredible accomplishment, winning a silver medal at the American Olympic Games. And his time of 32:06 was an American record for that particular event that held up until Ogalla Lakota runner Billy Mills broke it in the 1964 Olympic Games in Tokyo, Japan. Well, you can imagine this just was just absolutely remarkable. Of course, Jim Thorpe also was competing at this time in the Olympics, winning gold medals as well. Louis Tewanima coming home with a silver medal. Carlisle went crazy. I mean, they put on a huge parade. Students were just absolutely thrilled. And not long after the Olympic Games, Tewanima went back home and went back to his village. When he went back to his village, because his time at Carlisle had expired, Philip Zeyouma was waiting for him because it was supposed to be this big event, right, between Philip Zeyouma and Louis Tewanima, and they were going to have a Hopi showdown out at Stockholm on the Olympics. And the students were just so excited about this, but they never had that opportunity. But when Tewanima got home, Philip Zeyouma was waiting for him. He was waiting for him. And Zeyouma challenged Tewanima to a race, a 12-mile race out there, out in the village of Shongolpami, which I refer to as the Hopi Showdown on Second Mesa. When I was doing my book, I had a great opportunity to work with Neil Logan, who did the drawings. There are a number of drawings through colored pencil, actually, and so that he did for me. So colored pencil, but then these are also just in pencil. And Neil is a well-known sculptor here in the American Southwest, but he's also related to me on my mother's side. And so I would have to paint these images. I wrote these accounts down, the narratives down, and he put it down on paper. And this is one of the ones that he did. And what you have here is the depiction of this race, right? You've got Louis Tewanima, who's kneeling down. He's got one knee down. Philip Zeyouma. They're about ready to start this race. And what's going on here is that these older men who are now standing up, right, challenging them to the race, they were initially sitting down in the audience. Because you would imagine there have been a lot of people at the plaza at this time who would have wanted to see this race take place. And these older men were teasing these young runners because they arrived at the race wearing their school track uniforms, right? Their cross-country uniforms. And these older men in the Hopi language were calling out to them, teasing them, telling them that they didn't look like runners at all. Finally, Louis Tewanima was just like, look, if you think you're all that, you come down here and you show us what you can do. Well, the men took them up on this challenge. They're not going to let these younger runners certainly speak to them like that, or for this challenge to go unmet. And so these older men who newspaper accounts said they're probably in their 50s, maybe even a little older, joined the race. So now you have 4 individuals, right? You can imagine there would have been people just milling about, people on top of the buildings, laughing. I mean, it would have been good-natured fun, I would imagine. And they took off. Now they start going off on this race. And the newspaper descriptions through the New York Times talked about these men. When they joined the race, they had no shoes on. They had hardly any clothes on, and that they looked like they were dying of consumption, right? Which is an older way of saying they look like they were dying of tuberculosis, right? These tumors that were consuming their lungs. So they look sickly. At least that's what the report in the New York Times was saying. By the time they got to the 6-mile mark in this race, the older men were so far ahead of Zeyouma and Tewanima that these younger men just quit the race, right? And I was looking at various different accounts, not only through American newspapers, but also the Sherman Indian Museum, because the Sherman Institute newspaper also wrote about this account. And in the Sherman Institute newspaper, it said that when these older men had finished that 12-mile mark, wherever that mark was, right, that they just continued running, and they ultimately made an all-day jaunt of it. So they just continued, right? And I think that this shows you a number of different things, and I'll talk about a few of them as we wrap things up here. It shows you that some of the best runners within our communities, right, our native communities, never received any publicity, were never known outside of our villages, our native communities, but they were there. They were there. They were there. They were still doing their thing. They were still running. They were still practicing their culture in these kinds of athletic or sport type ways, right? Whereas Tewanima and Zeyouma, they had opportunities to go to these boarding schools, and therefore they got publicity through American newspapers and reporters, and so they became known, right? But then also in Hopi society and Hopi culture, the uncles, the older men, were given the responsibility to teach these younger men running according to Hopi ways, and so it's not surprising that these uncles, these older men, would have taken them up on this challenge. Philip Deloria, historian Philip Deloria writes here, they say that everyone back at Hopi knew runners with better wind and faster legs than the Olympian medalist Louis Tewanima. And of course, that was very true. It wasn't just Zeyouma who wanted to race against Tewanima when he got home, but there were other individuals. They were all lined up, including young kids who wanted to race against Tewanima. Well, you look after the 1912 Olympics and you get into the 1920s, one of the more well-known Hopi runners at this time was Nicholas Kawahunu, who is referred to by sports writers of the day, given this name of affection, Nimble Nick. He's perhaps most well known for running in the 1928 CC Pile Bunyan Derby, right, from Los Angeles to New York City, an event that started, I believe it was in March of 1928, and then went until May. He lasted up until about Williams, Arizona, and then he was just plagued with various different ailments, physical ailments. He just wasn't able to continue on. And I write about this in my book. Here's the Los Angeles Times report on it. Some years ago, when the Los Angeles Times held a marathon in Los Angeles, that's referring to the 1912 Los Angeles Times Modified Marathon. The Hopi Indians, so that would have been Zeyouma, and then also a runner by the name of Guy Maktaima from the village of Hotevilla, ran all the white boys off their feet because they got in first and second place, over 100 runners. But the Indian, that is Nicholas, couldn't hold the pace on this one. I have an idea that the pace was too fast for the shuffling dog trot, which made the Southwest Indians famous among the long distance runners of the world. It's interesting that they refer to the movement as a shuffling dog trot, right? I remember looking online once and coming across a PowerPoint presentation that Coach Rick Baker of the Hopi High School cross country team put together. And when he referenced, he said that when Hopi runners are running, they are dancing on Mother Earth. And I think that's a really good description of Hopi running, this idea of just tap, 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 right? Gentle dancing on Mother Earth. And of course, that description, dancing on Mother Earth, connects the individual with the land. Well, after we get past the 1920s and early into the 1930s, as a researcher, you notice very quickly that all these accounts of these Hopi runners and winning these different marathons, it pretty much stops by the time you get to the 1930s. And I think there are a lot of different reasons for that, right? But one of the reasons that I write about in my book are these modern influences, these distractions, if you could say, in modern society that exist. This is a world that is changing for the Hopi and other indigenous communities throughout the United States, right? Things are changing. There is a modern world that's developing all around them. J.H. Nylander, who's the principal of the Monkapee Day School in 1936, he says something really telling here in this letter that I uncovered in the National Archives. He says they, right, the Hopi, They are known for their long-distance running. Whether the younger men, after contact with modern smoking, liquor, and other such white influences, will sustain this endurance is a question. Long may the Hopi run, but will he? Louis Tewanima, after the 1920s, I mean, you see hardly, if any, records of him competing in any other events. He went back to his community. He went back to farming, to taking care of his sheep. He went back to a humble life as a Hopi individual. In 1954, he went back to New York City. He had competed in New York City. In fact, Madison Square Garden, he had competed there at that event. And now as an older man in 1954, he went because the Helms Athletic Foundation brought him there to give him this all-time U.S. track and field award. Photograph that you see here is of him arriving in the city. I believe this is around Times Square, I believe. And he's standing with American model Frances White, again in 1954. And at the banquet where he was to receive this award, he had an opportunity to speak himself. And I was really glad I came across this in the newspaper accounts. And he says, so when he came up at the banquet, he had an opportunity to speak. And he says, "We shall not be ashamed of ourselves of being who we are, but to stand firm on our own foundation, to walk along together as brothers and sisters, holding fast to our identity to receive the grand glory at the end. Just a humble individual. And, you know, considering that what all his people had gone through, right? He could have been a bitter individual at the end of his life, but that's not what he decided. And that's not the path that he decided to take. The Arizona Republic in 1954, in reference to his talk, remarked, "Tewanima's people would have been proud to see this man of humble worldly means, showing the assemblage in the Waldorf. He was truly an all-time Olympic great." He passed away, Louis Tewanima, of January 18th, 1969. And this is kind of interesting. I mean, you have in the Arizona Republic in 1969, the Arizona Senate yesterday stood for a moment of silent tribute after passing a legislation regretting the death of Louis Tewanima, first person named to the Arizona Sports Hall of Fame. Well, I loved writing the book, and you know, that was a wonderful experience. And after the book was written, after the book came out, I was contacted by Highlights magazine, and this is something that I'm really happy about. Of course, I grew up in Flagstaff, went to elementary school in Flagstaff, Arizona, and we always read Highlights. My parents subscribed to Highlights magazine when I was a kid, and so I was really thrilled that Highlights magazine had reached out to me and said, "Hey, you know, we know you have this book out. Could you help us with an article that we're writing about Louis Tewanima that's going to be seen by thousands of kids throughout the United States? But then also we would like for you to write a piece in it as well," which you see here on the right-hand corner. This idea of that Hopi running tradition continues, and I write about the annual Louis Tewanima foot race, which started, I believe, in 1969, first at the village of Kokotsmovi. Now it's held at the village of Shongopovi on Second Mesa, Tewanima's village, an annual foot race. This year's race was held virtually. I didn't know how the organizers were able to do it, but they did it, and I understand it was a huge success. Well, if you want to know more about Hopi Runners and the work that I'm doing, of course, you can look at the book. I believe Amerind Museum has this book in sale in its gift shop. They have several copies available. Also, the University Press of Kansas right now is having a discount. I told them about this event. I said, "Hey, look, there are going to be hundreds of people on the Zoom call. They might want the book. Can we give them a discount here?" So if you use this code HOPI30, you're going to receive a 30% off discount on the price of the book, plus free shipping. This expires on October 31st of 2020. But then you can also get the book on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, et cetera, et cetera. Okay, historians are often long-winded. I'm amazed that I actually stopped with some time left. I know it's not much, but I would be very happy to take your questions. I was telling my daughter, who's here in the office, in the studio now, this is going to be a sprint and not a marathon. Again, thank you, Kokwa, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Oh, thank you so much. We all really appreciate that. That was an absolutely fabulous presentation. We do have a question from Facebook, and you may have just covered this towards the end here. Are there any running competitions now?
Yeah, so you've got the Louis Tewanima foot race, certainly that happens around Labor Day weekend, I believe. You have the Paduakatsi race, which is the Water's Life, which is a much longer race. I think it's 30 plus miles. The Arrivee foot race is typically going, but then there are other races, and one of the things that take place, and I would just go to I believe the website Run Hopi would be a good place to look as far as different events out at Hopi. Again, also this event, the Louis Tewanima Foot Race was done virtually, and that was really cool how the event organizer, Sam Taylor, and his crew did an awesome job with that race, because people all over the world were running during a certain period of time, wearing their shirts in honor of this long tradition of running, or just running in general. So, yeah.
All right, the next question, have these stories reached the US runners of today?
I have, well, certainly that audience, just the running audience, is an audience that I want to reach with my work, that I've always wanted to reach with my work, right? In fact, I purposely, when I wrote Hopi Runners, really highlighted some of the work being done by runners today, those runners who are writing biographies or short stories or various different things like that. And some of these stories I shared on ESPN for their 30 of 30. They did a film called, I think it was Run Hopi or Hopi Running, and so that reached a huge audience, right? And still, you can see that being played. I think it's on either YouTube or it's online somewhere, but that was a huge audience. And so, yes, there is a Hopi audience here with this story, or Native audience, U.S. history, but that audience of the runners, right? Of just runners in general, because we can all relate to running. All of our cultures, it doesn't matter if we're indigenous or not. Our people used to be runners, right? Long before planes and automobiles, we were all runners, and so we all have a connection to this. We all know we have a connection to this.
Is there a history of women runners in the Hopi tribe?
Yeah, there is. So I in my book, I talk about women basket runners out at Hopi, out at the village of Walpi. There's some really interesting accounts. There's not a lot though, especially during this time period. And people have often asked me, well, why aren't you talking much about women runners at this time? Well, my sources, American newspapers, women weren't running these events during this time, right? For various different reasons. And so the last chapter of my book is called Still Running. And that's when I really start talking about more modern Hopi runners, including Carolyn Sikekwapiwa, who's probably one of the more well-known female Hopi runners of this time. And I was really thrilled to be able to do some research on her, and to be able to give her a shout out, certainly, and to write about her in my book. But as far as Hopi women runners, when you're looking at my book and studying my book, that's mostly towards the end in that chapter called Still Running, whereas the bulk of the book is between 1880 and the mid 1930s.
Okay. Susan would like to know, could you say more about To the Fence and Back? Where is the fence and what does it represent?
Yeah, so I've often wondered, exactly what Victor was talking about, like what fence he was talking about, right? So he's at the village of Hotvella. I don't know if it was, a fence that was out there to keep cattle from crossing. I don't know if it was the fence that the demarcator, there between Hopi land and Navajo land. I'm not exactly sure, right? But it was just this idea of there was a destination that he was going to. And in his mind, that destination was a fence, right? And he was going and then he was coming back, right? Going out and coming back like those clan runners, but it also speaks to Hopi clan history, or the clans, our Hopi clans and our Hopi clan migrations, when they emerge into this fourth world or this fourth way of life, that they migrated in all four cardinal directions, going out and then coming back, right? And so it's this cyclical understanding of Hopi way and Hopi understandings, especially in this context with running.
Are the Hopi people related in spiritual practice by running with the Raramuri people?
So yeah, that's a good question. So I talk about the Tarahumara runners a little bit in my book. And certainly, I would be interested to know if there was, a clan connection between them and between Hopi and the Tarahumara people. I mean, there are certainly clan connections between other indigenous people in indigenous Mexico, right? The migration, the movement of back and forth, and some of our clans, claim that their understanding is that they came from these regions south of us here. As far as the Tarahumara, there was an event in the early 1920s, and it was going to see who the best Southwest Indian runners were, and it was going to be held between the Hopi and the Tarahumara, and they never had it. It's my understanding the Tarahumara had told the event organizers that if the event wasn't 50 miles or more, that they weren't going to run.
Okay, we have time for about two more. The first of which being, please comment on the runners with water collected from around the world when they ran from Hopi to Mexico City and Puebla in 2004.
Yeah, so 2004, and maybe even there was a worldwide conference on water, right, in Mexico City, and you would have these runners and these Hopi runners who started. I can't remember where they started. They may have started out at Mount Kopi, so in the Tuba City area, and then went east to the various different villages to Wallapie, and then continued on. After they left the first Mesa villages on the east side, and continue on into New Mexico, the Pueblo villages where they collected water, right? This idea of water is life, right, which is represented in the word Patuwakatsi, right? Water is life, I think is so important. They took this water, right, and then they continued on to Mexico. Victor Masiasva actually has created a film on this. And I can't remember exactly what it's called. It might just be called Water is Life. I can't remember. I came across this DVD only once. It was at the Hopi show, I think probably back in like 2008, 2009. But there is a film about it. It's a fascinating thing. And it's that whole event of taking that water down to Mexico as part of this international convention on water is something that I talk about in my book.
And the final question is, what are you researching now?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm working on a book called Modern Encounters of the Hopi Past. And that's the title of it, Modern Encounters of the Hopi Past. And it's one of these books that is allowing me to take various different moments in Hopi history where the Hopi people are brushing up against or encountering the modern society around them. And so I've got a chapter on Hopi military involvement in the different world wars. I have a chapter on I write about the Santa Fe Indian Band. A number of Hopi individuals performed in that, including my grandfather, Victor Sakiestewa. And so I've got a chapter on that. So it's a movie industry. I've got a chapter on the Hopi and the film industry. Back in the 1940s, like there were like these films westerns, right, being produced out at Mount Kopi during this time with some big stars. No one knows about it, but the people do. people back home do. And so as an historian, it's just a huge thrill for me to take these stories and bring them to light so that a larger audience can know and learn from them.
Well, again, thank you so much for your time, Matt. We've really appreciate you sharing your time and knowledge. It's just been an absolutely fantastic presentation that you've provided with all of us today. Just a reminder to folks, on your screen, you will see it. His book is Hopi Runners, Crossing the Terrain Between Indian and American. And in addition to the University of Kansas, we are also offering a discount on it in honor of the Texas Canyon Trail Run and Matt joining us today. A link to that will be provided in our follow-up email that we will send to all of our registrants with the video of the lecture. That should be sent out to you hopefully within the next 24 to 48 hours. Again, thanks, Matt. We really appreciate your time. I hope you have a great rest of your Saturday.
All right. Well, thank you.
Take care. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.